Would you continue working in a place where reality seems to bend and twist around you? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in familiar settings? The heavy doors of the hospital's entrance slid open with a hollow sigh, swallowing the muffled city sounds into the sterile vacuum of the night. Sandra stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the gleaming linoleum floor, a pale echo beneath the harsh fluorescence humming overhead. The corridor stretched before her like a cold, narrow tunnel, shrouded in shadows that crept like silent spectators just beyond the edges of the harsh lights. In her blue scrubs, Sandra looked small and brittle. The fabric clung damply to her shoulder, dark stains mottled with coffee, dark and unforgiving. A sharp, bitter smell lingered, rising from the spill she'd just inflicted upon herself. Her hands trembled just a fraction as she tugged her ID badge closer to her chest, half hoping no one had noticed the clumsy accident. But the whisper caught immediately. A few glances flickered across the nursing station, a brief exchange of eyes. A low chuckle, barely concealed, rose from behind the distance as a colleague muttered, "Coffee catastrophe on shift 1." Sandra forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her cheeks flushing a deep ember red that contrasted starkly with the clinical whites and blues around her. The overhead clock ticked audibly in the quiet hallway, each second a reminder, slow and unforgiving. Tick, tick, tick. She wiped at the stain with shaky hands, the paper towel dissolving the warmth against her skin but not the heat crawling up her neck. Footsteps approached, heavy, quick, then nearing. Sandra's heart tightened, her breath shallow. "Hey, Sandra," a familiar voice called, clipped and casual but carrying a faint edge of condescension. It belonged to Lee, a nurse with years more experience, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. "You all right there?" Lee's gaze flicked down to the bear-sized blotch spreading across Sandra's scrubs. "Shouldn't be clumsy on your first night back." Sandra's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to nod. "I'm fine. Just a little mess." Lee smirked, then turned away, leaving a silence thick enough to suffocate. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows that lengthened and engulfed the empty beds in their cold embrace. Sandra exhaled, swallowing the knot twisting inside her as she ventured deeper into the corridors. The hospital at night was its own world, dim and quiet, filled with the soft murmurs of machines and the distant beeping of monitors. The air was cool, sterile, yet dense, as if the very walls held their breath. She paused at the nurse's station, the glow of the computer screen her only companion. A stack of patient charts lay piled, thick folders humming with stories, secrets, lives. She flipped through one habitually, but Froze's name stared back at her from the label of a chart she didn't recognize. Sandra Miller, it read, beneath a patient number she couldn't place and a room yet to be filled. A prickle ran along her skin, unnatural and sharp. Her breath hitched. The sterile scent of antiseptic seemed to intensify, wrapping around her like a shroud. This was a place where names meant lives. Why was hers marked on a sheet for a patient she hadn't seen? Footsteps echoed somewhere down the hall, distant, indistinct. Sandra forced the chart closed, her fingers lingering over the cold paper. She wanted to scream, to throw the folder down and run, but the pull of that name anchored her. Unseen eyes watched through the void of the hospital night, and her instincts told her she was no longer just a visitor to this realm. The corridor lights flickered again, the fluorescent bulbs pulsing erratically as if breathing in a glitching heartbeat. She looked up, her short auburn hair tousled from the spill, framing her pale, anxious face. The long shadows writhed on the walls, echoes of footsteps that weren't there and whispers she couldn't quite catch. A sudden noise stopped her, a sharp clatter in the supplies room. Sandra jittered, senses honing into the eerie silence following the sound. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The air tasted metallic. She took a slow step, then another, trailing toward the source like a moth to an uncertain flame. As she reached the door, the flickering light above cast her shadow long and stretched, warped by the bends in the linoleum. She caught her breath, hand trembling as it rested on the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was empty. Just rows of sterile equipment, gleaming under the failing light, yet everything seemed subtly off. The silence was too absolute, the shadows deeper than they should be. Something unseen shifted, a presence she could feel crawling beneath her skin. Her reflection in a chrome panel flickered unnaturally for a split-second, a glimpse of a version of herself that did not mirror her movements. She blinked hard, shaking the thought away like a whispered nightmare. The flickering light stabilized. The normal hum returned. Yet, Sandra stood frozen, a seed of dread planted deep within her, coiling with every tick of the omnipresent clock. She was alone, or so it seemed, but something watched, waiting in the folds of the night-shift silence. Sandra stepped back into the corridor, clutching the coffee-stained scrubs to her chest. The hospital held its breath, shadows leaning closer, the faintest whisper curling in the silence like a dark promise. And somewhere, unnoticed, the clock ticked on. A solitary flicker of the light bulb above cast a harsh glow on her bruised confidence, the night swallowing her wide-eyed and trembling figure, a fragile flame among the encroaching shadow. Sandra stared at the patient chart in her hands, the edges crisp and cold, the paper thick with a silent accusation. Her name, Sandra Miller, was printed boldly on the cover, as though labeling her a patient, a subject of something unknown. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, adding an unsettling hum to the air, as if the hospital itself was whispering secrets she was not meant to hear. Her fingers trembled slightly, the ink smudging under the weight of her touch. How could her name be here? She closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing the tide of disbelief and creeping unease. The coffee stain on her scrubs felt heavier now, like a mark branding her incompetence, a public reminder of the morning's humiliation. A distant intercom crackled briefly, a nurse's voice drifting fragmented through the static. Sandra's eyes flicked toward the empty hallway visible beyond the station's counter, silence swallowing the space like a thick fog. Behind the walls, machines beeped steadily, a mechanical pulse measuring lives, but also counting down time, each tick a step closer to unraveling or ending. Lee watched her from across the room, the curl of a smirk barely touching her lips. No words, just a glance, a silent reminder of Sandra's faltering grip on her place here. Sandra forced a tight smile that barely concealed the fire kindling inside her chest, a volatile mix of embarrassment and burgeoning defiance. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor as she made her way toward the dimly lit break room. The air was stale and cold, lights flickering fitfully like a warning, casting fractured shadows that danced along the peeling walls. She sank into a chair, chest rising and falling, caught between the urge to retreat and a flicker of stubborn resolve. She pulled out the patient chart again, flipping through the pages. Empty fields mocked her placeholders for vital signs and notes, waiting for a story that hadn't come. No admitting nurse, no diagnosis, just a blank canvas haunting her with its possibility. A sudden cold draft brushed her skin, the weak hum of the hospital transforming into a low, whispering murmur that seemed to snake through the cracks. Sandra's head snapped up, scanning the empty corridor beyond the break room window. A shadow flickered, too quick to be human, too fluid to be natural. She blinked hard, and it was gone. The clock mounted on the wall ticked louder, the sound oppressive, each minute a hammer driving in her doubts. She folded the chart slowly, tracing the letters of her name as if seeking reassurance. But reassurance was scarce in the sterile, isolating hospital night. Sandra's mind raced with questions and unspoken fears. Was this a mistake? Or something darker, a warning she couldn't yet comprehend? The walls seemed to close in, the once familiar corridors now foreign and menacing. Lee's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, sharp and dismissive as she approached. You really shouldn't be poking around in things that don't concern you, Sandra. We have procedures for a reason. Sandra looked up, eyes steady but her lips trembled. I don't understand why my name is on this. Someone has to explain. Lee's gaze hardened, the smirk fading into something colder. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're not as sharp as you think. The insult struck deep, twisted by the hospital's endless nights and the steady erosion of Sandra's confidence. Yet beneath the sting, a seed of resolve took root. Not defiance shouted, but a quiet flame kindling against the creeping shadows. Minutes passed in tense silence. Sandra's fingers curled around the edge of the desk, knuckles white with the effort to steady herself. Outside, the corridors lay empty, the lights flickering as if uncertain of the reality they illuminated. Her gaze returned once more to the patient chart. The quiet hum of distant machines, the faint creak of the building settling each sound layered the night with weight and meaning. She could no longer dismiss the subtle fractures in this place, the unseen threads tugging at her sanity. A long breath exhaled, slow and deliberate, as Sandra closed the chart firmly, the sound sharp in the stillness. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window, eyes wide, waiting. Somewhere deep within, the question burned: who was watching? And why was her name already written in unknown margins? The hospital clock ticked on, relentless and unforgiving, as the night thickened around her. Alone but not defeated, Sandra rose from her seat, the faintest glimmer of determination lighting the shadows in her eyes. The staff room breathed a lonely chill, the clatter of a loose chair settling the only sound as Sandra pushed the door closed behind her. The light above flickered half heartbeat, half warning, casting fragmented shadows that darted across peeling paint and worn linoleum like phantoms wary of the dark. It was a room meant for brief respites, for stolen breaths away from the clinical order of the hospital's spine. But tonight, it felt like something else entirely, a quiet stage for an unspoken mystery. Sandra's eyes caught a crumpled note pinned beneath a faded calendar on the corkboard. The edges were jagged, torn in haste, the ink a smudge of hurried strokes. She hesitated, breath-catching, before peeling it free. "We see you. Always." No signature. No date. Just those 4 words, folded around a shadow of meaning she couldn't yet unravel. The creeping sense of being watched in the empty halls, the reflection that didn't quite move in time, now found voice in the cryptic warning. The hospital's sterile breath seemed to tighten around her, squeezing the air from her lungs. The clock on the wall ticked louder, a metronome counting down a time she couldn't yet grasp. Each tick a drumbeat of her rising pulse. Was this a prank? A twisted joke from some bored night worker? Or something darker? Her gaze drifted to the window, where the hospital corridor stretched outward into shadow. Somewhere beyond, footsteps echoed softly, not quite hers, yet trailing close, always just out of view. Sandra's throat tightened. Her heartbeat thudded loud enough to drown out reason. The note in her hand trembled, and she felt the swell of isolation wash over her anew. The bitter taste of coffee still clung to her scrubs, a permanent stain marking a night spiraling into uncertainty. The patient chart with her name, it all converged into a shapeless fear clenching her gut. But beneath the fear, something resolute flickered. The shadows that danced along the walls no longer felt like prison bars. They were contours of a deeper truth hiding just beyond the edge of perception. Sandra folded the note carefully, as if preserving it like a talisman. Her hand steadied, the tremor fading into a quiet flame of purpose. The dim light above flickered once more, this time steadying, casting her face in soft but clear illumination. The hospital seemed to inhale around her, the silence swelling with unspoken secrets. She pressed the note to her chest, feeling its jagged edges bite through the thin fabric of her scrubs. From the corridor, a low murmur drifted, the whisper of pages turning, a door creaking somewhere distant, subtle but real. Sandra's eyes narrowed, focus sharpening like a knife honing its edge. The threat was intangible, a presence shifting in layers of reality she could no longer dismiss. Her reflection caught again in the small window pane. This time, her eyes met their own with newfound clarity. No longer just a frightened nurse lost in the hospital's grasp, She was a seeker of the frayed edges, someone who would unthread the hidden. The lingering scent of antiseptic mixed with the bitter brew of her spilled coffee, grounding her in the familiar while the unknown beckoned. A muted intercom buzz broke the silence, the message lost in static but the urgency unmistakable. Sandra exhaled, a slow, steady breath that seemed to push back the invisible weight pressing down from the shadows. Her steps, once faltering, now echoed with a measured certainty as she moved back toward the main corridor. The hospital's night shroud was no longer a veil to hide behind but a labyrinth to navigate. The clock ticked on, indifferent but relentless. And Sandra, with the mysterious note clenched in her palm, stepped deeper into the unknown, ready, at last, to see what was watching her back. The night deepened, thick and viscous like ink pooling in the veins of the hospital. Sandra's footsteps echoed hollowly down the endless corridor, the walls stripped of warmth, bathed in the cold, clinical glow of flickering lights. Each tick of the clock mounted above the nurse's station hammered in cadence with her quickening pulse, a ruthless reminder that time in this place was a cruel commodity. Her hands curled tightly around the edges of the patient chart, the one with her name there in neat, haunting printed. Her eyes scanned over pages filled with stark numbers and cryptic notes that did not belong to anyone she recognized. The records flickered inconsistently, patient lists showing variations each time she located a ghostly deception that unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. Determined not to be swallowed by the shadows of doubt, Sandra began cross-referencing the charts. The initial discrepancies felt like clerical errors, a simple twist of fate or negligence amidst the chaotic machinery of hospital bureaucracy. A misplaced date, mismatched vital signs, an admission recorded hours before the patient should have arrived. Small inconsistencies, but patterns that did not add up, signals beneath the surface of sterile formality. As she pored over stacks of documents, the hospital seemed to lean in around her. The echo of distant monitors beeped irregularly, mechanized breaths in the stillness. A shaft of dull light fell through a grimy window into the room where she worked, catching motes of dust suspended like spirits. She rubbed her eyes, a brief sting that spoke of sleepless nights edging into obsession. "Find anything useful?" The voice sliced through the thick silence like a razor. Turning sharply, Sandra met with the skeptical glare of Tom, a fellow night nurse with a guarded expression. His blue eyes narrowed not with warmth, but suspicion. "Just some odd discrepancies in the records," Sandra admitted quietly. Tom shook his head, leaning against the doorframe with a weary sigh. "You're reaching. These things happen all the time. You're tired. Maybe you should get some rest before jumping down rabbit holes." But Sandra's resolve had crystallized. She couldn't afford to falter now. "There's something off here. Not just errors, something deliberate." Tom's face tightened. He looked away, the muscles in his jaw taut, the room thrumming with an unspoken tension. Determined to trust herself more than the whispers of exhaustion, Sandra plunged deeper into the maze of files. Fingers tracing names, dates, and room numbers, she stumbled on a pattern: patients who should have been discharged yet vanished from records without explanation. Rooms assigned to no one, records missing entirely, whispers of a ghost narrative beneath the hospital's official ledger. The air around her grew colder, each breath crystallizing with a metallic edge. Shadows gathered in the corners, a silent audience watching her unravel the threads. Her reflection in the glass of a cabinet warped, a flicker where her eyes seemed to plead for reason in a place that offered none. A sudden noise startled her, a soft murmur of voices in the hallway, too faint to discern, but urgent and hushed. Sandra pressed her back to the wall, heart pounding loud enough to drown the whispers. She caught a glimpse of a dark figure slipping behind a corner, vanishing before she could step forward. Questions spiraled in her mind like a storm. Who was manipulating the records? What had happened to the missing patients? And why was her name entwined in this chilling tapestry? The ticking clock seemed to quicken, every second a drumbeat pressing her forward. An icy determination settled in her bones. She would unearth the truth, even if it meant facing the shadows alone. But as she reached for the chart again, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into a strobe of darkness and harsh white, and the faintest sound of a distant door closing echoed a sound that shouldn't have been there. Her breath caught. The hospital was alive with secrets, and it was watching. Sandra's eyes darted to the corridor again, where silence had resumed, thicker than before, suffocating and absolute. She swallowed a shudder, the patient chart tight in her hands, the first movement in a war against unseen forces. The investigation had begun. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her like an ominous chorus as Sandra moved silently through the dim labyrinth of the hospital's night shift corridors. The patient chart clutched tightly in her hand felt heavier somehow, as if the pages themselves were saturated with the weight of the secrets it held. The stale air was thick with anticipation and the faint metallic tang of antiseptic, framing the hospital like a cage suspended in time. She had refused to let the shadows consume, had refused to let the whispered disapproval of her colleagues dictate the thin thread holding her together. Yet with every step, the doubts gnawed at the edges of her mind like persistent, restless phantoms. Tom's warning echoed relentlessly, maybe you should get some rest. But resting meant surrender. Surrender meant being swallowed whole by the creeping darkness that clung to every corner of this place. Tonight, Sandra had decided to dig deeper. She had quietly accessed the hospital's digital records, tracing the irregularities lurking beneath the surface. And what she uncovered was worse than prison's cold walls or whispered rumors. It was a fracture in trust, a betrayal carved into the fabric of the hospital itself. A nurse she had once trusted implicitly had tampered with records, erased entries, altered discharges, and concealed the existence of patients who should have been accounted for. Each falsehood was a thread unraveling a tapestry she could barely begin to understand. Her breath caught as the door to the supply room opened quietly behind her. Footsteps approached, deliberate and measured. Sandra spun, clutching the chart tighter. It was Lee. Her eyes shimmered with a cold amusement, lips curved in a knowing, thin smile. "I see you're poking your nose where it doesn't belong," she murmured, voice a low rasp cloaked in warning. Sandra's heart thundered in her chest. Why? Why hide things? People disappear, and no one is held accountable. It doesn't add up. Lee's gaze hardened, a flicker of something inscrutable passing over her face. "There are things you don't understand, Sandra. It's better you don't." Her words dripped like poison, seeping into the crevices of Sandra's resolve. The weight of betrayal settled like a shadow, a cold pressure pressing down from all sides. The nurse she had once seen as a guide and ally now stood as a gatekeeper to truths too dangerous to confront. Lee stepped closer, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Watch your step. You're not the first to ask questions. And those who do." Her eyes flicked towards the corridors stretching dark and endless beyond them. "They don't always come back." Sandra's breath hitched, a wave of icy fear crashing against her resolve. But beneath the terror, a spark flared, a fragile, fierce ember refusing to be smothered. She stepped back, eyes sharp. "I can't ignore this. People deserve answers. Even if it means walking into the dark." Lee's lips pressed into a thin line, and with a quick, final glance, she disappeared down the hallway, swallowed by shadows as though never there. Moments later, Sandra was alone again, the corridor stretching before her like an open wound. The chart felt like a burning weight in her grasp, the silence pressing in. She looked down at her reflection in the glass panel nearby, tired eyes staring back, brimming with a quiet fury and determination tangled with exhaustion. The flickering light above stuttered and hummed, casting jagged shadows that fractured her reflection into shards of doubt and hope. Suddenly, distant footsteps echoed, frantic, uneven, breaking the stillness. Sandra's head snapped toward the sound, heart tightening. A hurried voice crackled through the intercom. Unintelligible, frantic, a plea lost in static. The temperature in the hallway dropped sharply. Breath misted in the cold air, visible and trembling. The corridor stretched into darkness ahead, whispering promises of truth and peril. In that moment, Sandra realized she was no longer just a nurse in a hospital. It was a battleground between what was seen and what lurked beneath. Her fingers tightened around the patient chart, knuckles white beneath the blue fabric of her scrubs, as the flickering light cast long shadows behind her and stretched forward into a night that refused to end. The silence returned, thick with foreboding, broken only by the slow, relentless tick of the hospital clock. And somewhere, hidden in the folds of shadow, something watched back. The hospital's silence was a living thing that night, heavy, suffocating. Sandra's footsteps felt muffled, swallowed by the thick shadows that clung to every corner like a shroud. The flickering light bulb overhead sputtered intermittently, casting fractured pools of weak light that barely pierced the growing darkness. Each pulse of flicker was a heartbeat, dragging time slow, thick, and oppressive. She moved cautiously down a seldom used corridor, guided now less by certainty and more by a gnawing insistence in her gut. The patient chart, tightly clasped in her hands, had become a mappa guide charting the invisible fractures beneath the hospital's orderly facade. Her fingers traced the edges of faded pages, searching for answers that hid in plain sight. A low creak drew her attention to a nondescript door slightly ajar. The kind of door that slipped unnoticed through years of neglect and routine. Sandra hesitated, breath shallow, senses rippling with cold anticipation. Steeling herself, she pushed it open, the hinges groaning like a ghost's lament. Inside, the room lay sunken in shadow, lit only by the faint glow leaking from the hallway. The stale air was thick with dust and secrets, tangible like a breath held for too long. Rows of dusty filing cabinets stood sentinel like forgotten tombstones of countless lost histories. But it was the space beyond the hidden room that wasn't on any blueprints that held the true weight of the night. Sandra stepped inside, heart thrumming, eyes adjusting to the gloom. Broken medical equipment lay scattered like relics of abandoned lives. Faint traces of dried blood stained the floor tiles crisp and jagged, like claw marks etched into the sterile fabric of the hospital. Then, from the far corner, a soft sound, a scrape. A whisper. She spun, the thin bleeps of machines from distant wards replaced by a crushing silence, broken only by the ragged rhythm of her own breath. A shadow flickered, not her own, dancing along the peeling wall. Her pulse surged, every nerve alight with raw, electric fear. "Who's there?" Her voice was sharp but brittle, cracking under the weight of the unknown. No answer, only the rhythmic ticking of the clock echoing loudly through the walls. The long corridors beyond stretched like a void, cold and endless. As her eyes adjusted, she spotted a worn photograph pinned to the back wall, edges curling. The image was old, faded, a group of nurses from years past. One face in the crowd was strangely familiar, another Sandra, or so it seemed, blurred but unmistakably identical. A sudden noise behind her, a muffled thud, the shift of something heavy, made her whirl around. But the room was empty, save for the eerie silence that pressed upon her like a living thing. Her hands clenched the patient chart, the fever of discovery mixing with ice-cold dread. These secrets were buried in darkness, a hidden chamber of lost patients, erased histories, vanished caregivers. The hospital was not a sanctuary. It was a labyrinth of deception. As she turned to leave, the door slammed shut violently, as if by a ghost's hand. Panic surged, yet beneath it, a fierce resolve bloomed. No longer doubting her senses, no longer questioning the whispers, she would face whatever lurked here. In the dim glow of the flickering bulb, the shadows thickened, and Sandra faced the truth. She was fighting a force woven into the hospital's very bones. Alone, shadowed, a single heartbeat amid the ticking clock. And then the final, chilling discovery. A patient file wedged beneath the cabinet, not catalogued anywhere else. The name on the label sent a jolt through her veins, Sandra Miller. She stared, breath caught, a cold wave breaking over her. The realization struck like shattered glass. It was no longer just about missing patients or hidden rooms. It was about her. She was part of the hospital's hidden story, a living thread in a tapestry of shadowy disappearances. The light bulb flickered violently one last time before plunging the room into darkness. In that sudden blackness, Sandra's breath hitched the weight of what she'd uncovered settling like a stone in her chest. Somewhere beyond the solid walls, the hospital waited, watching. A silence that was no longer empty, but charged with secrets. And Sandra, caught on the knife's edge between fear and clarity, stood ready to unravel them. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an erratic pulse, throwing shadows that danced mockingly across the cold, blank walls of the hospital. Each flicker cast a deeper gloom, snuffing out fragile hope like a candle caught in a sudden draft. Sandra stood stiffly beneath this wavering light, her posture fragile, threadbare under the weight of isolation that wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. The night shift was unforgiving, but nothing had cut deeper than the conversation she'd just endured. Words whispered in sterile rooms, voices raised behind closed doors, a reprimand harsh, almost cruel, aimed to silence rather than understand. They called her obsession dangerous, reckless. The once welcoming hospital felt like a cage, barbed with doubt and suspicion. Her blue scrubs, usually a symbol of care and purpose, felt like ill-fitting armor now, stained with a coffee smudge and the residue of every whispered doubt. Her own reflection in the darkened window, distorted and distant, mirrored back a woman unraveling. The auburn strands fell messily across her face, framing eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and mounting despair. Sandra's hands trembled as she clutched the patient chart, the very chart that had ignited her resolve, now a fragile lifeline slipping through her fingers. The faces of vanished patients haunted the margins of her mind, their silent absences echoing louder than any reprimand. The silence around her was oppressive, thick as fog, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and lost dreams. The corridor stretched endlessly, empty and echoing, swallowing sound in its appetite. Shadows spilled from the corners like spilled ink, pooling and thickening with every tentative step she took. A window rattled in the cold night wind. The flickering light overhead plunged momentarily into darkness. For a split second, Sandra felt the hospital breathe a slow, measured exhale that rattled glass and shook her resolve. She pressed her forehead against the cool windowpane, cold biting stark into her skin. Outside, the city lights flickered in distant disinterest, impersonal and unreachable, a universe apart from the narrowing, claustrophobic halls she wandered. Maybe you're not meant to see this, the quiet, venomous thought echoed inside her skull. Her lips parted to speak, but no words came, swallowed by the cavernous silence. The clock ticked on relentlessly, its monotonous beat marking minutes that slipped like sand through trembling fingers. Time in this hospital wasn't a friend. It was a judge, sentencing her to isolation, to invisibility. Tears tracked quietly down her cheeks, unnoticed beneath tired eyes. They were not tears of surrender, but of fracture, the slow unraveling of a tether once strong enough to hold her upright. The corridor stretched long and empty, its depths without end, suffocating even as the sterile walls closed in. Her shadow fractured beneath the flickering light, a fractured apparition of hope and doubt intertwined. Sandra inhaled deeply, the cold air sharp in her lungs, but it did nothing to steady the trembling inside. She felt stranded between two worlds, the familiar sanctuary of her hospital and something darker, lurking beneath the surface, distant but relentless. Her footing faltered, knees weak, as if the floor itself might give way beneath her, pulling her into an abyss of uncertainty. Alone, tethered to a fading purpose, she sank to the floor, the patient chart slipping from her fingers, falling open to a blank page, a silent void reflecting the sudden emptiness inside. The hospital's breath seemed to still, the ticking clock a cruel reminder of all that was lost, and all that might never be found. The corridors of the hospital felt endlessly long, their sterile walls extending like cold glaciers, impervious and indifferent. Sandra moved through them as if suspended in a dream, a ghost drifting through this labyrinth of buzzing fluorescent lights and tubes humming with lifeless rhythm. The din of machines was a cruel counterpoint to the void opening inside Hera Void, intensified by moments earlier, when her manager dismissed her desperate attempt to share the truths she had uncovered. "You're chasing shadows," the words cut deeper than any reprimand. "Stop disrupting the flow." Behind her eyes, the world spun slow and silent, a suffocating stillness that clung to her like freezing sweat. The hallway stretched ahead, barren and echoing, footsteps swallowed by the cold. Each step felt heavier than the last, dragging a weight through the sterile air, a heaviness that burrowed deep within her bones. She passed the nurse's station, abandoned in this exhausted hour, its pale glow casting angular shadows that twisted and writhed unnaturally. Sandra's reflection flickered in the windowpane, a fractured image, fractured self, the auburn hair tangled, cheeks hollow, eyes shadowed and wide as if seeing things beyond this world. At her side, the patient chart lay forgotten on the metal countertop, the stark white pages glowing eerily in the dim light. An unfinished entry stared back at her empty fields where names, dates, and vital signs should have been. It was as if the very paper itself was voided of meaning, a symbol of everything slipping through her fingers. Then, a sudden coldness swelled in the room, an imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. Sandra's breath fogged, visible and fragile, then faded. A shiver slid down her spine. The sound of a distant door creaking echoed like a lament through the empty halls. Her gaze drifted toward the shadowed bend of the corridor. A soft thud reverberated behind her, the faintest murmur of footsteps that didn't belong to any living presence. Her heart lurched. The hospital, a place that once fostered life, now seemed to breathe with a poisonous pulse, its very heartbeat a slow, mournful dirge. She sank down onto the cold floor, the chill seeping through her scrubs and skin, grounding her in this fragile moment of collapse. Her hands hovered over the chart, trembling as if it was a fractured relic of a lost faith. Tears formed, glistening like fragile drops of ice as they slid unbidden down her cheeks, tears not of defeat, but of a fracture so deep it blurred the line between sorrow and absence. From the hollow silence around her, the distant ticking of the hospital clock echoed sharp, methodical, merciless. Each tick was a gauge of time running out, an empty mark pressed into the fabric of her fading hope. Around her, shadows stretched and pulsed, swallowing light, swallowing everything. She pressed her palm flat against the floor, reaching not just for grounding, but for any remnant of herself that might still cling to purpose. But the cold was absolute. The stillness, unyielding. Sandra's breath slowed. Her eyes fluttered shut. The world narrowed to the briefest flutter of soothed darkness, pierced only by the faintest glimmer of a flickering light bulb overhead, its steady, wavering glow a fragile beacon in the suffocating silence. And then the silence deepened, now no longer just empty, but total. She was alone. And the weight of that solitude pressed down like a closing coffin, sealing her away from light, sound, and any last thread of salvation. The hospital's corridors stood bathed in a muted twilight, shadows pooling beneath flickering fluorescence that sputtered uncertainly like a dying heartbeat. Sandra sat alone on the cold, hard floor near the nurse's station, the patient chart crumpled loosely against her knees. The ticking of the clock above was agonizingly slow and loud, each tick a reminder that time was slipping away not just from the night, but from her grasp on reality and hope alike. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, chest tightening as the weight of darkness pressed closer, relentless and cold. The empty halls seemed endless, stretching and folding into themselves, swallowing light and sound with an indifferent hunger. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung like fog, mixing with the faint metallic tang that seemed to seep from the hospital's very bones. Sandra's fingers traced the edges of the chart absently, torn between surrender and the faint pulse of something else, something raw, fragile, waiting to ignite. The faded blue fabric of her scrubs felt heavier than ever, like a shroud of burden she carried silently. A distant sound broke the oppressive quiet, a soft, hushed whisper threading through the hollow corridors. She looked up, eyes wide and searching, straining to hear. "I've seen you." The voice seemed to emerge from the shadows, not quite human, but not entirely ethereal either. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it rippled through her like a shard of ice. Her heartbeat caught, a flicker of recognition sparking within the darkness. Sandra pressed her palms to the floor, grounding herself, the rough texture biting through the numbness creeping in her fingers. She remembered the note from the staff room, the words that had unnerved and compelled her days before. "We see you. Always." The faintest glimmer of awareness had not yet gone extinct. In this moment of deepest despair, it twined through her like a slender thread of light. Her weary gaze drifted toward the nurse's station window, where the dim glow of the hospital's weak nightlight flickered uncertainly. The reflection she caught was no longer fractured and distant, it seemed steadier, an echo of the woman who had refused to yield despite the shadows. A slow breath exhaled, a fragile resolve kindling quietly beneath the crushing weight of isolation. She straightened, the chart folding open at her side, its blank pages now a promise, not an end. The flickering light, that silent sentinel over the night shift, steadied, casting a soft, unwavering glow that chased away the edges of the darkest shadows. Sandra rose, her movement slow but deliberate, stepping toward the faint light. The hospital, vast and unyielding, waited in hushed anticipation. And in the echo of that quiet, steadfast glow, a seed of conviction took root. The time to confront the unknown was coming. Beyond the silence, beyond the shadows, a journey was just beginning. The hospital's oppressive shadows began to lift, slow and hesitant, as if uncertain whether to retreat or advance. Sandra stepped into a space once suffused with terror, now touched by a fragile flicker of dawnlight seeping through cracked blinds, casting golden streaks across the cold tile floor. The atmosphere felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary struggling to emerge from darkness. Her breath was shallow, but not trembling. The faint hum of the emergency generator in the distance replaced the chilling silence, a steady reminder that life persisted. Her eyes, once vacant and haunted, now lingered on the surroundings with cautious curiosity, trying to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, the nightmare she had endured was beginning to dissolve. She paused near the nurse's station, her hand lingering on the cool surface, feeling the residual tremor of doubt and fear slowly ebb away. A surge of warmth, subtle but undeniable, coursed through her fingertips, spilling into her chest like a dawn breaking in a long, dark night. Sandra's gaze fell on the patient chart she'd clutched so tightly for so long, the pages now comfortingly intact, the ink unfaded. She realized, for the first time in what felt like forever, that she had the power to rewrite her own story. The shadows that had once held her hostage were retreating, reluctantly conceding to a tiny, persistent spark of hope. A faint sound echoed down the corridor, a soft beeping, a mechanical whisper. It was the monitor from the nurse's station, blinking steadily in sync with her heartbeat. The strange, unsteady rhythm of earlier nights was settling into something familiar, something human again. Slowly, she turned toward the window, the glass reflecting the early hints of light outside. The city's skyline was hazy, bathed in the pale pinks and oranges of dawn, a stark contrast to the darkness she had fought through. And within her, a quiet realization blossomed: she had faced the abyss. She had stared into the void and begun to reclaim her strength. Her hand brushed against the patient chart again, a gesture of silent affirmation. She looked at her own reflection now, no longer fractured but steady, resolved. The hope flickering in her eyes was faint, yet luminous enough to challenge the darkness that still lurked just beyond the periphery. For the first time, she whispered softly, "I am still here." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile but powerful, a promise of resilience. A gentle breath settled inside her, slow and deep, as she took in the diminishing shadows, each one retreating, yielding to the promise of light. And with that, Sandra stepped away from the shadowed edges of the hospital, a tentative but vital shift toward dawn and toward herself. The shadows recoiled as Sandra stepped into the abandoned wing of the hospital, her figure luminous against the oppressive darkness. A faint, golden dawn seemed to seep into her, illuminating her with each step, a testament to her newfound resolve. The silence was thick, yet now it felt purposeful, as if the building itself acknowledged her transformation. Her eyes flashed with clarity, a light born from the depths of despair. She clutched the worn, faded nurse records that had once been her obsession, now a talisman of her strength. With trembling hands, she flipped through the pages, each name, each secret aligning into a mosaic of truths that she would confront. The air grew warmer, less suffocating, as if courage itself had begun to breathe life into the stale corridors. The flickering light steadied, casting a steady glow that cut through the darkness like a blade. Every breath she drew was a pledge, an act of defiance against the malevolence lurking within these walls. In the deeper shadows, she sensed the malevolent force, the unseen entity that had once manipulated her perception. But now, she faced it not with fear, but with compassion, understanding that the darkness thrived on chaos, on confusion. Her voice, steady and unwavering, echoed into the void. "This ends now." A flicker of acknowledgement from the shadows, a ripple in the cold emptiness, almost as if the hospital itself responded. Sandra moved deliberately toward the core of the darkened wing, where she sensed the heart of the entity of fractured consciousness twisting reality. As she entered the demarcation of light and shadow, her mind conjured memories of her journey. Every moment of despair, every whisper of doubt, now transformed into a reservoir of strength. Her purpose crystallized in that instant, a beacon to pierce the dark. She reached the ancient Corian empty chamber, cold and silent, save for the faint hum of electricity. Her voice softened, yet carried the weight of her purpose. "I know you're here. I understand now. You don't have to hide." The shadows writhed, but she stood resilient, her gaze piercing through the illusion. A wave of warmth radiated from her, an internal glow that spread outward, casting away the creeping dark. The malevolent presence hesitated, then receded, unable to withstand her newfound strength. From the depths, a gentle, almost tender whisper emerged, not malevolent but mournful, frail, an echo of long-lost pain. "Why do you fight?" Sandra's eyes softened as she knelt, placing her hand carefully on the cold, metallic surface. Her voice was gentle but insistent, "Because I believe in hope. I believe in healing. And I refuse to let darkness define me or this place." The shadows bend, then break apart, revealing a fractured, shimmering light finally freed from its prison. Silence fell, profound and complete, as the darkness dissolved into nothingness. A luminous glow filled the room, illuminating the hospital's abandoned corridors with a new dawn. Sandra rose, breath steady, eyes bright. She turned slowly, her silhouette bathed in this light, a vessel of hope reborn. The hospital, its shadows eased back into the void, now stood as a testament to her courageous silent affirmation that even in the deepest darkness, hope can ignite a light capable of tearing apart the night. The hospital's shadows had all but dissolved, vanishing into the light that now poured relentlessly through the once dim hallways. Sandra stood in the heart of the abandoned wing, bathed in a radiance that seemed to emanate from within her, breaking through the remnants of darkness like dawn piercing night's last veil. The flickering bulb above, a symbol of ambiguity she once feared, now burnt steadily, unwavering in its glow. Her face was calm but fiercely alive, eyes shining with a sense of purpose forged from the abyss. Her shoulders, once burdened by despair and doubt, now radiated strength, a testament to her journey from silence into clarity. Her hands, which had trembled at the brink of collapse, clenched into fists of conviction, holding tight the knowledge she had earned. The whispers of the shadows had dissolved, replaced by a profound silence that thrummed with the vibration of newfound resolve. Every step she took echoed with quiet authority, as if echoing her inner rebirth. She moved purposefully down the corridor, passing the nurse's station, no longer a place of despair but a gateway to justice for the unseen horrors uncovered. In her mind, she replayed the moments, the secret rooms, the mysterious disappearances, the unseen force that manipulated perceptions. These horrors no longer felt like chains but like lessons learned, confirming her unwavering belief that good and truth could prevail. The air was thick with serenity, yet an electricity persisted, her unshakable focus shimmering like a shield. She clasped the patient chart tightly, not as a shackle, but as a relic of her endurance, a sacred artifact reminding her of her purpose. Standing at the threshold of the core chamber, she drew a deep breath, her chest rising with a strength that felt rooted in defiance and compassion alike. Her voice, steady and resonant, broke the final veil of darkness. The shadows are gone. The truth remains. And I will face whatever is left, not with fear, but with unwavering purpose. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer rippled through the Ira, ripple of affirmation, a silent acknowledgement from the hospital itself. The silence was no longer oppressive but empowering, echoing her words deep into every fiber of her being. In that moment, Sandra closed her eyes briefly, letting the light fill her mind and spirit, sealing her transformation into a guardian of truth. She was no longer a shadowy victim lost in darkness, but a beacon of Happian embodiment of resilience and justice. As she turned to face the final confrontation, her posture poised, her gaze fixed on the unknown beyond the shadows, her silhouette was bathed in pure, white light, a living symbol of renewal and justice. The hospital, once a maze of despair, now radiated an aura of peace and clarity, the silence filled not with emptiness, but with the promise of victory. The morning light seeped softly through the hospital windows, gentle tendrils of gold and rose that cast a warm glow over the quiet halls. Sandra sat silently by the window in her small, sunlit room, the patient chart resting lightly on her lap. The shadows and fears that once haunted her had receded into the background, replaced by a fragile serenity. Her face bore traces of exhaustion, yes, but also a calm and acceptance born from the clarity of her journey. She looked out over the city, its waking chaos a distant hum compared to the stillness inside her. The hospital behind her now seemed less like a prison and more like a chapter closed, a chapter that tested her resolve and reshaped her understanding of strength. Her hands rested softly on the patient chart, her fingers curled delicately around the edges as if holding onto a fragile reminder of her perseverance. The crisp paper felt warm, alive, infused with the quiet echoes of her past struggles, a silent testament to her endurance. The air was filled with the gentle hum of activity beyond her room, nurses moving with purpose, distant footsteps in rhythmic patterns of reassurance. But inside her, an even deeper current now flowed, the steady pulse of peace. She inhaled deeply, the scent of dawn mingling with faint memories of shadowed corridors and whispered fears, now fading into the background. For the first time in many nights, she closed her eyes and simply breathed, letting the calm wash over her like a tide, smoothing away the jagged edges of doubt. Her mind softly replayed the moments, the dark rooms, the silent whispers, the shadows dissolving before her, each one a fragment of a darker chapter that had finally found its end. A small, knowing smile touched her lips as she opened her eyes. She reached up, briefly touching her auburn hair, a symbol of her vitality, her human vulnerability. The hospital's light played softly across her features, illuminating the quiet strength that now radiated from within. Her gaze lingered on the empty corridor beyond the glass, no longer a place of chaos but a space of peace. The distant clock, once ominous, now ticked steadily, a gentle metronome marking her internal rhythm, calm, resolute. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "It's over." The words carried a quiet weight of hope, of rebirth. A gentle understanding settled into her heart that the shadows had been faced and conquered not through force alone, but through unwavering belief in her purpose. Slowly, she rose, the patient chart still in her hand, and took a tentative step toward the door. Each movement was deliberate, steady. She paused for a moment at the threshold, looking out across the hospital with a gaze filled with gentle acceptance. The world outside was still restless, but within her was a stillness, a profound peace that stretched beyond the confines of the room. As she stepped into the corridor, her figure bathed in the soft glow of the morning, Sandra carried with her a quiet promissory vow to nurture hope in every patient, every moment, and every shadow she had faced. And though the hospital hummed around her, she moved forward, her spirit softly glowing, at peace with all she had endured and all that was yet to come. Sunlight poured through the large hospital windows, bathing the corridor in a soft, golden hue that seemed to cleanse even the deepest shadows of the night. Sandra sat on a bench near the window, the patient chart resting in her lap like a treasured relic. Her gaze was steady, serene, as if she had finally woven together the fractured edges of her soul forged through darkness. The air in the room felt lighter, infused with the quiet hum of life beyond the glass voices in the distance, footsteps softly echoing. Yet inside her, a profound tranquility blossomed, woven from acceptance and forgiveness. The fears, the shadows, the manipulation had been acknowledged, faced, and released. What remained was a serene understanding, a peace so deep it shimmered in her eyes like dawn. She gently traced the edges of the patient chart, a symbol of her journey, its every line, every faded inked name a testament to resilience. The hospital, once a claustrophobic prison of shadows, now felt like a sanctuary of hope. She was no longer a scared girl fleeing into denial, but a healer reborn, a guardian who had stared into the abyss and emerged luminous. A faint smile hovered on her lips as she closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant life outside. The clock, its ominous ticking now soft and rhythmic, reminded her of the delicate balance she'd fought to restore. Time, she realized, was a fluid thing, a river that could carry away pain, fears, and shadows if she let it. She remembered the whispers, the shadows, the whispers of that unseen force, an echo of despair that once sought to consume her. But she now understood it for what it was, a fragment of herself trapped in fear, a distortion that she had willingly faced and dissolved. She had broken through her own illusion, forging a new path based on compassion and clarity. In that quiet moment, she whispered softly words filled with gentle forgiveness, both for herself and the unseen force that had muddled her perception. "Thank you for showing me my strength. I forgive you." The words floated into the air, a ripple of peace rippling through the silence. Her hands, once trembling at the dawn of her journey, now rested peacefully on the chart, fingers loose, relaxed. Her face lifted, absorbing the warmth of the morning, soon a reminder that even amid shadows, light can beckon. Slowly, she rose, mindful of the scars visible and hidden that had stitched themselves into her soul. Carefully, she folded the patient chart, pressing it gently to her heart, giving thanks for every hardship, every lesson. She moved gracefully into the corridor, no longer a place of fear, but a space of healing. The hospital was still, yet alive with a new vitality, resilient, hopeful, and forever changed by her courage. She paused at the threshold, taking a final, deep breath, gazing at the light spilling across the floor like a welcoming embrace. The shadows had receded, but their memory remained as a quiet reminder, an echo of what she had overcome. And as she stepped forward, her silhouette swallowed by the luminous wave of dawn, she carried the promise of renewal within her, a testament that even in darkness, the heart finds a way to heal. The scene lingered on her figure, a peaceful icon of rebirth and quiet victory, before fading into the gentle glow of daylight, leaving the hospital behind as a symbol of hope reborn. The hospital, now bathed in the gentle, golden hue of dawn, was a sanctuary of quiet grace. Sunlight spilled across the corridors, illuminating every corner where shadows once lurked. Sandra sat at the hospital's large window, the patient chart resting softly in her lap like a relic of resilience, the edges worn but the spirit unbroken. Her eyes, once haunted by darkness, now shimmered with the serene light of understanding. The air was still, imbued with a profound sense of peace, a silence that was more than absence of noise. It was a symphony of gentle acceptance. The clock ticking in her mind had slowed, each moment now a tender ripple in the continuum of hope. Her breath was deep and steady, the kind that comes after a long journey through storm and shadow. Beyond the glass, the city stretched out in tranquil awakening, its restless pulse now muted, reconciled with the quietude that bloomed within her. The hospital's halls echoed softly with distant footsteps, but they lacked menace. They seemed like gentle reminders of the life that persisted, of healing that had finally taken root. She lifted the patient chart, her fingers tracing the faded ink, now imbued with a new meaning, the story of suffering and victory woven into every line. Her gaze lingered, eyes closed for a moment, as if listening to a silent symphony only her soul could hear, an ode to courage, to hope, to the healing power of belief. A faint smile curved her lips, tender and unguarded. Her reflection in the window's glass mirrored a woman transformed, hardened by adversity but softened by newfound purpose. She had faced the darkness not with fear, but with compassion, not with despair, but with resilience. In that quiet space, a gentle gesture, a soft hand on her heart, embodied her silent vow to nurture hope wherever it could flourish. The shadows, once monstrous and suffocating, had become part of her story, teachers of her strength. As the sunlight washed fully over her, she exhaled slowly, releasing the last of her burdens. No longer a prisoner of shadows, she sat peacefully, a guardian of light, embracing the calm that had finally come. Her gaze rested on the horizon, where dawn's promise stretched infinitely, whispering softly of new beginnings. And in that moment, deep, gentle, eternal, the shadows faded entirely into memory, leaving only the quiet, lasting peace of a heart reborn. What if you knew something was coming but couldn't stop it? Share your thoughts below.